Okay, so this is the last 2 weeks of our class, and so what we're going to be doing for this section is we're going to look at primarily the supply side of the economy, and we're going to start off by looking at the production curves, and then we're going to move into looking at cost curves, which is then going to allow us to study the different market structures. So we're going to find that when we look out to the world outside, there are 4 kinds of market structures. There's perfect competition, there's monopoly, they're the 2 extremes, and then we have the monopolistic competitive firms and oligopoly. And what we're going to study is look at, the different characteristics of these different kinds of market structures. And at the end of the day, we're going to be able to see why having competition in a marketplace is quite beneficial. But before we start looking at all of that, what we have to do is we first have to begin with product curves, as strange as that might sound. So again, we're going to start off by looking at cost of production, which will take us into time frames that we have in economics, which will then allow us to move to cost curves, which will then allow us to look at the market structures. So we'll start off. Time frames in economics, we have 3. And we're going to retrace back to this, but this quick overview. So when we say something is the short run in economics, what we're saying is that we're holding at least one input. So remember, from first day of class, we have land, labor, capital, and then we always also include the entrepreneur. So it's where at least one input, one resource is fixed. And so we can think about the short run for a firm as like the daily operations of a company. Then we have long run. So this time frame in economics is not defined by any particular time. So notice this here. We don't say short run is 1 month. It's just where one input's fixed. So when we say long run in economics, we're allowing for all our resources to change. So there's no fixed inputs. All inputs are variable. And then we have our very long run, which is where we allow for not only our resources to change, but also technology to change. And given the world of today, with the technological advancements happening so quickly around us, companies need to be responsive and aware of what's going on in their short run, long run, and their very long run, if they're going to survive. So we'll begin with production curves. So just to give you a sense, what a production curve is, it's information that firms use, which allows them to know that given combinations of inputs, what they're able to produce. And we have to study the product curves in order to be able to then study the cost curves, which then allows us to study the different market structures. And you'll see why as we go along. But just from intuitively, if you think about this, if you're a company, you need to know if you want to produce, and let's say you're producing thermoses. So like I have my, my thermos here. So let's say that's my business. So if I want to produce 10 thermoses, I better know how many people I need to hire and how many pieces of equipment I need to have in order to be able to produce a certain number of thermoses. That's what a production curve does. It gives the firm that information. So the production curves, I'll read here. I don't like reading slides, but we'll briefly read. Allows the firm to determine different combinations of variable inputs, given something fixed, that will be necessary to produce some amount of output. And we're going to be doing an example of this. It informs a company of the technological possibilities for efficiently combining resources to produce some amount of output. So again, we're going to expand more on that in a minute. And it gives a company that wants to remain in business and remain competitive information they need to know in order to be able to survive, because you don't want to be the company that's hiring, double the amount of people that you need to produce some amount of output. So companies that are new into an industry, they may not understand yet how many people they need to hire in order to produce some amount of output. But somewhere along the way, very quickly, they're going to have to learn if they're going to stay in business. So as an example here of what we mean by technically efficient, the easiest way is just to give this. So if you were a company and I told you, in order to produce 10 cars, you've got two choices. You could either use 3 workers and 10 machines, and that would get you 10 cars produced, or you could hire 20 workers with the same 10 machines and still only get 10 cars. So if you were given as a manager these two options, it would make sense that the one that you'd want to go for is the one that requires fewer inputs. So that's all we mean by technically efficient. It's the combination of inputs required, the least number to get some amount of output. We're going to assume that companies are always going to want to select those combinations. And so that we kind of move forward assuming that with production theory. And again, like I was mentioning before, we may not know it right away if we're new to an industry, but companies will need to learn it very, very quickly. So another way, and it's not so much for this class, but if you were to continue on with higher level economic courses, you'll find that production curves are generally given in a mathematical equation. And so what you'll find is we'll say something like the output, so that's what we're producing, is a function of the amount of labor and capital you have. And keep in mind, when we say capital in economics, we're referring to the machinery and equipment. Okay, so for our purposes, we aren't going to use a mathematical equation. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use a table form. And you must be able to do this because you will have this, you will be given something very much, well, you'll have an example problem at the end of this when we go through it. But you will be given a question or a series of questions exactly like we have on these PowerPoints on your last exam that you'll be taking. So please be sure that you're able to do this. So I'm just going to start off. So we're going to assume that we have, let's say we're a farmer, so we have 500 acres of land, and we're saying we have 3 tractors. So the tractors are what you use for farming. So you're told 500 acres of land and 3 tractors. So right away, those are your fixed inputs because they're a given. Now granted, if you wanted to have more land, you could eventually buy more land, but that doesn't happen overnight. And the same with tractors. Let's say you want more tractors. Well, again, you could always buy more, but that doesn't always happen overnight too, because tractors are actually quite expensive. So a company might have to get a loan, which there's a process involved. So we're in short run here. So here's first point. Production curves is a short run idea because there's always something that's fixed. But what we're allowing to change here is what we call, well, not what we call, well, yeah, our variable input. So our variable input to most firms is always going to be their labor. So, you know, if we hire nobody, even with our 500 acres of land and 3 tractors, this is saying we're only going to get 0 output. So in essence, you can have all the fixed inputs you want, but if nobody's working those machines, and even automated industries require some humans, you know, overseeing these machines. So if you hired nobody, this is saying you would get no output. And then we just keep going down. So you would be given these 2 columns in any question. So how you would read this is it would say, okay, with my 500 acres of land and my 3 tractors with 1 worker, I get 6 units of output. If I hire 2 people, I get 14. If I hire 3, I get 22.5, and then so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these different ideas of what we call marginal and average products. So you need to know what each one of these things, which each one is, right? So total product, this is this column that we were just talking about, is the total amount that a firm is able to produce with some, you know, combination of inputs. Then we have this marginal, and then we have this average. So the word marginal in microeconomics means extra or additional. So this marginal product is telling us what's the extra output or what's the change in our output when we change the amount of laborers working for us. And then our average is going to be looking at, okay, what is it on average? What's the average amount of output that we get from hiring an additional, or not from additional, but from some number of laborers or variable input. So what we're going to do here is we're going to figure out marginal product and average product. So this right here, down here, is just kind of doing what I had previously mentioned, you know, how you interpret what this number means. You need to understand that. So like total product of 0, that says with 500 acres of land and 3 tractors, we get absolutely no output. But if on the other hand, you hire a variable input of 1, so you hire 1 person, what do you get? Well, now we get 6 units of output. If we go down to variable input of 7, so 7 workers, because our variable input is always going to be, for our purposes, number of workers, we're now going to be able to get, what is it, 46 units of output. So that's what total product tells us. But sometimes, and more often than not, we want to understand what each additional worker is going to provide to a company. So, you know, let's say you're a manager of a department in a company and you need to hire an extra person to help you in your office. If you went to your manager and said, I need an extra person working for me, they'd be like, okay, but why? So you would want to be able to explain to them that by hiring this extra person, one of the ways you would do it is say that if I'm able to hire this extra person, this is the additional amount of output that we'd be able to get, which would then allow us to sell more and which would be more profit for the company. So that kind of an idea is coming from this idea of marginal product. So I have all the numbers here, but the thing is you need to be able to understand how we get these numbers. So this slide 11 is really, really important, okay? So marginal product is how much does my output change, okay, when my variable input changes. So if I go from 0 to 1 people hiring, how much does my output change by? So we see that if we go from 0 to 1 worker, our output goes from 0 to 6. So that would be, this number, marginal product is 6, would be 6 divided by 1, which is 6. So the change in my output is 6, like it's here, over the change in my labor, which is 1, so 6. So how do you interpret this? This says, this part you have to get to, by hiring that 1 additional worker, this firm's output will increase by 6. That's what that tells you. But let's say now we want to know what it is at 4. What's the extra? So what do? So we say, okay, when we move from, remember, it's incremental from one point to the next. So the way we would get this is we would say, okay, from 3 to 4, how much did my output change by? So it went from 22.5 to 32. So that would be a 9.5 change, divided by the change in my labor, which I've made it just increments of 1. So the extra output would be 9.5. So the way you would explain this is by hiring the 4th worker, output goes up by 9.5. And then we would do it at the 9th worker. So let's just, this is an interesting one, right? Because that's not a mistake. This is negative. So the output changes by, it goes from 46 to 44, so it's a drop of 2, negative 2, over the extra worker of 1. So by hiring this particular worker, number 9, our output has actually dropped by negative 2. Now, what is very important here is to realize that this isn't saying that number 9 worker, the 9th worker, is a bad worker. And this isn't saying that the 4th worker is actually even a better worker than the 1st worker, okay? What this is saying is that given these fixed inputs, the different combinations of these goods, as we hire more people, the extra output at first goes up. So it would make sense. Think about it. If you only have 1 person working on a farm with 500 acres, that's a lot of land for one person to have to deal with. So if you, as you hire more people, the extra output that we get will increase because that combination of people with these fixed inputs is making more sense. You know, having more people working this huge number of acres of land, you're going to get more production, more extra happening. But then there'll come a point where I'm going down here to like really the point where now we hire the ninth worker, and what has happened is it's actually led to a negative. So that would kind of be this idea of overcrowding. So it's not that the ninth worker is a bad worker. It would be more the idea that if we only have the three tractors, I think we started out with, and 9 people now trying to use these 3 tractors, you know, they're going to start getting in the way of one another. So the extra output can actually be driven down. So it wouldn't make sense to want to hire a worker that's going to pull your extra output down. And we'll retrace that in a minute. Another idea you want to get from here is this idea of, and I'm going to kind of highlight it, is this law of diminishing marginal product. Really important idea, or marginal returns. You'll see it both ways, LDMR or LDMP, law of diminishing marginal product. So this is this idea that your output extra, so that's marginal, goes up, 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 hits a point, some high, so it goes up, 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 hits a point, then it begins to drop. And notice it drops at 9. So we're not looking for the lowest number, we're looking for the place at which the extra begins to go down. So what this is saying is that somewhere along the way, the extra output we get from hiring more people is going to drop at some point. And that would be, in this case, you could say a couple ways. It would be at the 5th worker, or you could say after the 4th worker. And what this idea is that given something is fixed, so we started out 500 acres of land and the 3 tractors. So if you have something fixed, if you keep adding something to something that's fixed, somewhere along the way, you're not going to get as much out of it. So I've always thought of it or likened it to what I heard many years ago was, let's say you excuse me, buy a little pot, a small little pot, and then a little bag of seeds, and you want to grow a plant. Okay, so if you take one of the seeds from that packet of seeds you got and put it into the pot, the plant will probably grow really nice. But if you took the entire packet of seeds, say there's 100 seeds in this packet, and you threw them all into this teeny little pot with some dirt, none of those plants would grow because they'd strangle one another. That's kind of the idea with the law of diminishing marginal product, that if you keep adding and adding and adding to something fixed, somewhere along the way, the extra has to go down. And that's the law of diminishing marginal returns. And then we have this idea of average, because averages is an important idea too. So this tells us, you know, on average, okay, so you always have to start it off, preface it with the word on average, because it isn't average. So this tells us on average what each worker produces. So while marginal says what exactly that particular worker by hiring them adds to output, average tells us on average what each of those number of workers produces on average. So the way you get an average, again, you just got to remember this, memorize it. I hate saying to memorize anything in economics, but formulas, you want it memorized. You take your total product, so like it says right here, you take, whoops, sorry, highlight wrong thing. You take your total product, so that's this column, right, and divide it by your variable input. So you're never going to have anything on where there's 0, so I always like putting an X. So to get your average here, you would take 6 and you would divide it by the one variable input, that's 6. To get it at 2 units, the way we would get this is we would say it's 14 units of output divided by 2, that's 7. So that tells us that by hiring 2 workers, each of those two workers would produce on average 7 units. While the marginal says the first one would produce 6 by hiring that first one, and by hiring the second, output would go up by 8. So very, very different piece of information. So at variable of 4, how do we get it? So we would take 32, the total product, divided by our total labor, divide that out, and we get 8. So this says at a variable input of 4, we on average would get each of those 4 workers producing 8 units of output. So there is a relationship that we find exists between marginal and average. So the general rule, you want to learn this right here, is this, that when your marginal or your extra is a bigger number than your average, it's going to pull your average up. So the way I always like to remember it is with your grade point average. So let's say your marginal is the grade you get in this class. So extra is your grade right now. So if you came into this class with an average grade point average of a 3.0, so that's a B average in the United States. So you come in with an average of a 3.0 GPA, and you only take this class and you get an A. That's your extra grade. Well, an A is a 4.0. Your extra grade of a 4.0 is bigger than the average of a 3. So your average GPA will go up. If, on the other hand, you got a C in the class, so your marginal, the grade for the extra grade is a C, and you came in with a B average, that's going to cause your average to go down. And then if you came in with the B average and you end up with a B in the class, your average won't change. So this relationship between marginal and average stands true because it's a mathematical, in quotes, truth for everything we're going to do going forward. So you'll see a couple questions a little later on when we look at this. The reason that we're showing it here is because this relationship between the marginal and the average is what helps kind of explain how these diagrams look. So again, your marginal goes up, 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 hits a point, goes down, 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 down. Your average goes up, 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 hits a point, and goes down, 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 down. And that relationship between the marginal and average, because when marginal's higher, right, higher than average, what has to be happening to average, what has to be increasing? And then once marginal's less than average, your average must be going down. So there has to be a place at which the two cross or intersect. So that would be where they're equal. So it's not a random thing, the way these product curves end up looking when we diagram them out. So again, slide 17, you'll want to review it. That's what I was reviewing when I went over the GPA. All right, so if I told you as a question, let's suppose 2 workers can produce 30 cars, whilst 3 workers can produce 39. Okay, so how would you interpret what we just did? So this would be your 2 workers, they're your variable input, right? And the 30 cars would be your total product or your output. That's what that represents. Whoops. And then you're told that 3 workers, so that's your variable input again, can produce 39 cars, which is your total product or your output. So then you're asked, what's marginal product of the 3rd worker, what's average product of the 2 workers? So you need to be able to do this. So if we want to know marginal product of the 3rd worker, remember, it's the change in the total product divided by the change in the variable input. That's how we get marginal product. So do we have that information? Well, yeah, we do. We had product was 30 and now it's 39. And we're told that we've given the incremental change from 2 to 3. So we would look at the change is 9, change in the variable input's 1, so that's 9. And that's how we came up with this answer of 9 cars. Then it says, what is average product of workers? So how do we get average? Well, that's total product divided by variable input. So whilst the marginal is looking at the change, you know, what's the change? The average is just looking at the total at that particular place. So the total product at 2 workers was 30, right? And at 2 workers, so that would be equal to 15. So that's how we came up with this answer of 15 cars. So you need to be able to understand and be able to do this. If I asked you, if average product only increasing, is the average product only increasing if the marginal product is increasing? No, it's going to depend, right? It's going to depend where we are. So you want to review that slide 17 and retrace back to this answer. Okay, so this is a great problem. So this is exactly, trust me, exactly what you'll have on the exam. So you'll be given a table just like this, and you'll be asked a series of questions. I'm not going to do them here. I'm going to ask that you do them. And then if you have problems understanding the next slides that follow, then you need to make sure you come on and see me on my Zoom hours or email me. So just quick reminder, we're told you have 1 factory and 1 machine. So those are your fixed inputs. So remember, that means we're in short run. It's a short run. And so you're going to go through and figure out marginal product, average product, where does law of diminishing marginal product and so forth take us. All right, so the next little section we're going to do is look at cost curves. And it might seem a little bit strange here, but before we look at cost curves, we're going to have a look at this idea of profits in economics. And then we're going to go back to the production curves and show how we get to the cost curves. And then we're going to start looking at market structures. So in economics, in order to get profits, and actually it's not just economics, it's accounting too. The way you get profits from a firm is it's a formula. So you take the revenue that the firm's making, so the money coming in, and you minus out costs. So that's how we get profit. So the revenue that a firm makes isn't the same as their profit. So profits are, you take the revenue, so all the money the company's bringing in, and minus out all their costs. So like they have to pay for electricity, and they have to pay for all the workers they hire and the supplies and so forth. So profit is revenue minus costs. An accountant defines it exactly the same way. However, where the difference is how economists define the costs. So though the formula is identical, in quotes, identical for accountants and economists, there's a slight difference on how they interpret costs. And the big difference is economists, remember, their main goal is to understand why people do the things they do. I mean, economics is a social science. We're studying behavior. We want to understand people's behavior, and if we can understand that, which sometimes is hard to understand, but it allows us to hopefully have some good policy that we can implement, you know, out there in the economy. But we have to understand things first. So what economists try to do is understand why is it firms open and close. While an accountant's job is really more about saying, okay, is this firm making money from some standard? And if so, then this is the amount of taxes you're going to have to pay to the government, and this is the amount of profit you're going to report, you know, if you're on the stock market, or to your stockholders, or whatever it may be. An economist looks beyond that. An economist says, okay, we need to also take into account what else this company could be doing with their money, for example. So in order to really look at this we're going to just do an example. I've tried it so many different ways, and I really feel this is the easiest way. So if we were a company, okay, that pays their workers $1,000 a month, that's the cost to pay our employees. That's an explicit cost. So that would be included in economic costs, and it would be included in accounting costs, okay? Because you get something, you get this person working for you and you pay them something. It's explicit. Then we have this other kind of cost, which we call an implicit cost or an opportunity cost. So, for example, let's say the person that is running the business gave up $100,000 a year job. Okay, so they start the business and they could have stayed where they were and kept making $100,000, but they gave that up. Okay, that's an opportunity cost. You gave up something to have your own business. So an economist would want to include that. An accountant doesn't want to include that because the IRS doesn't care what you gave up. But an economist does care because it's going to help them understand the behavior of this company. Another example, suppose a person invested $50,000 into their own business, but the money that $50,000, they could have put it into a certificate of deposit and be making some interest. Okay, so the interest that you forego would be an opportunity cost as well. So again, that would be something the economists would want to include. So economists, when they define total costs, include what you're giving up. So here's another example to really try and get the point across. So let's say you're a doctor, you were earning $300,000 a year and you decide you want to open your own practice, okay? So your first year in business, you're told, we're just telling you, you earn $500,000 in revenue and your explicit costs, notice the costs I'm saying here, are $250,000. Okay, what would an accountant do? Well, they would take your revenue minus your costs. So revenue minus your costs, according to the accountant, you're making $250,000. Sounds pretty nice to me. An economist would say, hey, you know what? We need to also include what you gave up. So notice here what happens here. So what the economists will do is, it's still revenue minus costs, but it's how they've defined costs. So an economist not only includes the costs of, you know, all these things that you had to pay to have your practice, but they also include what you gave up, which was your $300,000 job. So according to the economist, this doctor has actually, they made a loss. So here, the accountant would say, you just made $250,000, now you need to pay the government some amount of tax. The economist would be like, oh no, you haven't made money. You're actually worse off than had you stayed where you were to begin with. Why is it again so important? The reason it's important is because where an accountant couldn't explain why this person would shut down and go back to their other old job, an economist can. The economist would be able to say, yeah, you're actually better off where you were elsewhere than where you are right here, comma, all else constant. Because some people are willing to give up these things in order to not have somebody tell them what to do, for example. So there are a lot of people that will continue to have their own business because they get some other benefits. But just purely on this right here, it doesn't make sense to stay in business for yourself. So that's kind of what this is trying to sum up, slide 31. So you'll want to take a little bit of time and really think about what slide 31 is saying. So why are we including it? It's because, again, it helps us understand behavior and why people do things they do. So with all of that, slide 33 is real important, particularly when we start studying market structures. But what you've got to understand when we start going through it all, profits, when we study profits, are based on economic profits, which is based on revenue minus total costs, which are including both the implicit and the explicit costs. So in economics, when we say profits are zero, that means the person would be doing as well as their next best alternative. So that means your accounting profits would still be greater than zero. When your economic profits are greater than zero, you're doing better than your next best alternative, and less than, which is the example we did, you're worse off than your next best alternative. But interesting with that one is you could still have a positive accounting profit. Okay, so quick reminder, we've got 3 time frames: short run, long run, very long run. So right now we're still staying with the short run. So we're going to drop the profit idea momentarily for probably until the next video. I'm going to drop that. We'll come back to that. I just wanted to introduce it because we're going to look at cost curves now. So we have product curves. Remember, real important. They tell or inform companies what combinations of inputs we need in order to produce some amount of output. So we take that information, and then from our product curves, we're able to go ahead and figure out what our cost curves are. So in order to be able to study these different market structures, we've got to get to our cost curves, but still a few more steps before we're there. All right, so this is just a quick picture of what our cost curves look like. So we'll come back to this picture, but this is what they end up looking like after what we're going to do next. All right, so from our cost curves, we're then able to derive this thing called a marginal cost curve, which is then going to help us determine, when we study market structures, and where a firm is the best place, in quotes, to produce, which will then allow us to determine what quantity to produce and how much to charge. So in order to be able to do that, we've got to, again, understand our costs. I know I keep saying that, but it's really important that you understand that you can't figure out costs without knowing product curves. One has to go before the other. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to have a look at how we go from our total fixed costs and total variable costs and put them together. But before we do that, I'm actually going to take a break, hold off on looking at how we go from one point to the next. I'll post this video, and then we're going to look at that relationship between product curves and our cost curve.